The rain came down in sheets that night, the kind that numbs your skin and blurs the world into shadow and cold. Captain Sarah Morrison stood at her front door, soaked to the bone, staring at a young woman she had never seen before. The woman's eyes were hollow, her lips trembling, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she said those 3 words that would change everything. "Please help me." Sarah had been home from deployment for exactly 17 days. 17 days of adjusting to civilian rhythms after leading combat operations in hostile territory. 17 days of sleeping with one eye open, of checking corners in her own house, of feeling the weight of command even when there was no one left to command. She had lost her husband 2 years prior, not to war, but to a drunk driver on a rainy night much like this one. The irony was not lost on her. She understood grief. She understood loss. But what she saw in this young widow's face was something deeper, something sharper, a terror that went beyond mourning. Behind Sarah, in the living room, her retired Navy SEAL neighbor's K9, a Belgian Malinois named Riggs, let out a low growl that made the hairs on Sarah's neck stand up. The dog had been left in her care while his handler was away, and in the 5 days they had been together, Riggs had never reacted this way. He moved to the door with purpose, his body tense, his dark eyes fixed not on the woman but past her, into the rain-soaked darkness beyond. That moment, that shift in the dog's demeanor, was the signal that this was not a simple plea for help. This was the beginning of something dangerous. What would you do if someone showed up at your door begging for help, and the only warning you had came from a dog who sensed what you could not see? Sarah had learned early in her military career that hesitation could cost lives. She made her decision in the span of a heartbeat, pulling the young woman inside and locking the door behind her. The woman stumbled forward, her clothes dripping puddles onto the hardwood floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Sarah guided her to the couch while Riggs maintained his position by the door, his ears alert, his body coiled like a spring. The woman said her name was Emily, that she was 24, and that her husband had been a Marine who died 6 months ago in a training accident. Sarah recognized the look of fresh grief, the kind that still felt like an open wound. But there was something else there too, something that spoke of immediate danger rather than the slow ache of loss. Emily's hands shook as she accepted the towel Sarah offered, and when she spoke again, her words came tumbling out in a rush of fear and desperation. She explained that men had been following her for the past week. At first, she thought it was paranoia, the hypervigilance that comes with trauma. But then she noticed the same car outside her apartment, the same faces in different places, always watching. She had gone to the police, but without concrete evidence, there was little they could do. She had reached out to her late husband's unit, but they were deployed overseas. She had nowhere else to turn, and then she remembered that her husband had once mentioned Sarah, a company commander he had worked with during a joint training exercise, someone he respected deeply. Emily had tracked down Sarah's address through military networks, a desperate act that spoke volumes about how cornered she felt. Sarah listened with the focus she had honed through years of intelligence briefings and tactical assessments. She asked questions, specific ones about the men, the car, the timing of their appearances. Emily's answers painted a troubling picture, one that suggested this was not random harassment, but something coordinated and deliberate. Sarah had seen enough in her career to know that when patterns emerged, there was usually a reason behind them. She had served in military intelligence before transitioning to infantry leadership, and her instincts were screaming that Emily had stumbled into something far more dangerous than she realized. Riggs remained at his post by the door, but his attention shifted periodically to the windows, his nose working the air. Sarah trusted that dog more than she trusted most people. Military working dogs were trained to detect threats that humans missed, and Riggs was among the best. His handler, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hayes, had deployed him on over 50 combat missions, and the dog's record spoke for itself. If Riggs was on alert, there was a reason. Sarah moved to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain, scanning the street outside. The rain made visibility poor, but she caught sight of a dark sedan parked 3 houses down, engine running, headlights off. Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the cold clarity that came when training met reality. She had spent years preparing for threats, assessing dangers, making split-second decisions under pressure. This was no different. except that this time the battlefield was her own neighborhood, and the person she was protecting was a grieving widow who had nowhere else to go. Sarah let the curtain fall back into place and turned to Emily with the calm authority that had defined her leadership style throughout her military career. She told Emily that she believed her, that she was safe here, and that they would figure this out together. But first, Sarah needed information. She sat down across from Emily and began a methodical debrief. The same process she had used countless times with soldiers returning from patrol. She asked about Emily's husband, about his work, about anything unusual in the weeks before his death. Emily explained that David had been a logistics specialist, responsible for tracking equipment and supplies. It was not glamorous work, but it was critical, and David had taken it seriously. In the month before he died, he had seemed distracted, stressed in a way that went beyond the normal pressures of military life. He had mentioned irregularities in inventory reports, supplies that did not match up, shipments that went to the wrong locations. He had planned to report it up the chain of command, but then the training accident happened, and everything changed. Sarah felt the pieces beginning to align. Corruption within military supply chains was not unheard of, and if David had discovered something significant, it could explain why Emily was now being targeted. Someone wanted to know what David had told his wife, what evidence he might have left behind. Sarah asked if David had kept any records, any files or documents at home. Emily nodded and pulled a small USB drive from her jacket pocket. He had given it to her 2 days before he died, told her to keep it safe, that it was insurance. She had not understood what he meant, had been too overwhelmed with grief after his death to even look at it. But now, with men following her, with the fear closing in, she realized it must be connected. Sarah took the drive and knew immediately that this changed everything. If the contents were what she suspected, Emily was not just in danger, she was a target, and anyone helping her could become one too. Riggs suddenly barked, a sharp warning that cut through the quiet of the house. Sarah was on her feet instantly, moving to the window with the drive clutched in her hand. The sedan had moved closer, now parked directly across the street. 2 men stepped out, both wearing dark jackets, both moving with the kind of purpose that suggested military or law enforcement training. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could call the police, but if these men had connections, that could put Emily in greater danger. She could try to run, but she would be leading them on a chase through residential streets with a terrified widow in tow. Or she could do what she had been trained to do, hold her ground and use every advantage she had. She looked at Riggs, at the powerful animal who had been trained for exactly these kinds of situations, and she made her choice. She moved to the hallway closet and retrieved the secured lockbox she kept there, the one that held her service pistol and spare magazines. She had hoped never to need them outside of the range, but hope was a luxury she could not afford right now. Sarah checked the weapon with practiced efficiency, the muscle memory of hundreds of training drills taking over. She was not a warrior by nature. She was a leader, a strategist, someone who believed in protecting her people above all else. But she had learned in combat that sometimes protection required force, that sometimes the only way to save lives was to be willing to take a stand. She returned to the living room where Emily sat frozen on the couch, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah knelt beside her and spoke in the steady, reassuring tone she had used countless times to calm soldiers under fire. She explained that the men outside were likely looking for the drive, that they would not stop until they got it, but that Sarah was not going to let them take it or hurt Emily. She told Emily to stay low, to move to the interior hallway where there were no windows, and to trust that Sarah knew what she was doing. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face, and did as she was told. Sarah watched her go, then turned her attention back to the door, to Riggs, and to the threat that was now undeniably closing in. The knock came hard and loud, the kind meant to intimidate. Sarah stood behind the door with Riggs at her side, her hand resting on the dog's head to keep him steady. She called out, asking who was there, and a male voice responded that they were military police investigating a matter involving Emily Carter. The use of Emily's full name confirmed that they knew exactly who was inside, but Sarah's instincts told her these men were not legitimate. Real military police would have called ahead, would have arrived in marked vehicles, would have followed protocol. These men were operating outside the system, which meant they were either corrupt or contracted, and neither option was good. Sarah made a decision that drew on every ounce of her training and experience. She told them through the door that she was an active-duty Army captain, that she did not recognize their authority, and that they needed to leave her property immediately. The silence that followed was heavy, and Sarah could feel the tension building like a storm about to break. Then came the sound she had been expecting, the metallic scrape of a lock being picked. They were not asking for permission anymore. Sarah stepped back and gave Riggs the command that Marcus had taught her, a single German word that meant protect. The dog moved into position, his body between Sarah and the door, his focus absolute. The door swung open, and the two men stepped inside with weapons drawn. They were professionals, that much was clear, but they had made a critical mistake. They had underestimated the woman standing before them and the highly trained combat dog at her side. Sarah did not hesitate. She ordered them to drop their weapons and identify themselves. When they refused, when the first man raised his pistol toward her, Riggs launched forward with a speed and ferocity that was breathtaking. The dog took the man down in seconds, clamping onto his arm and forcing the weapon from his grip. The second man turned his weapon toward the dog, but Sarah was already moving, her own pistol trained on him with the precision of someone who had qualified expert marksman year after year. She told him to lower his weapon, to get on the ground, and to do it now. The authority in her voice was absolute, the same tone she had used to command soldiers in combat zones, and it had the desired effect. The man hesitated, looked at his partner writhing on the ground with Riggs holding him in place, and made the smart choice. He dropped his weapon and raised his hands. Sarah ordered Riggs to release, and the dog obeyed immediately, stepping back but maintaining his alert stance. She moved forward and secured both weapons, then ordered both men onto their stomachs with their hands behind their heads. She had zip ties in her emergency kit, another item left over from deployment, and she used them now to restrain both men. Only then did she allow herself to breathe, to feel the adrenaline coursing through her system, to acknowledge the magnitude of what had just happened. She had just detained two armed men in her own living room, with only a dog and her training to protect her. It was not the homecoming she had imagined, but it was the reality she was living. Emily emerged from the hallway, her face pale, her hands shaking. Sarah told her to call 911, to report an attempted break-in and armed assault, and to specifically request that the responding officers contact the military police and the FBI. If this was about corruption and stolen supplies, then it was a federal matter, and Sarah wanted to make sure the right people were involved. Emily made the call with trembling hands while Sarah kept her weapon trained on the two men on her floor. Riggs sat beside her, calm now but ready, his eyes never leaving the intruders. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for the dog, for Marcus who had trained him so well, for the chain of events that had brought Riggs into her home at exactly the right time. She had always believed that things happened for a reason, and tonight that belief felt validated in the most visceral way possible. The police arrived within minutes, followed shortly by federal agents who took custody of the two men and the USB drive as evidence. Sarah gave her statement with the clarity and precision that came from years of after-action reports, detailing everything from Emily's arrival to the break-in and the confrontation. The hours that followed were a blur of interviews, evidence collection, and coordination between multiple agencies. Sarah's living room became a crime scene, marked and photographed and cataloged. Emily sat in the kitchen with a victim advocate, recounting her story yet again, while Sarah stood on her front porch with a special agent from the FBI. The agent, a woman in her 40s named Carver, had a no-nonsense demeanor that Sarah appreciated. Carver explained that the USB drive contained detailed records of supply theft and diversion, a scheme that had been siphoning military equipment worth millions of dollars over the course of 2 years. David Carter had stumbled onto it while doing his job, and his death, which had been ruled an accident, was now being reinvestigated as a possible homicide. The two men Sarah had detained were former military contractors with connections to the smuggling operation, and their arrest was already leading to additional warrants and investigations. Carver looked at Sarah with a mixture of respect and curiosity, asking how a company commander living in a quiet neighborhood had managed to take down 2 armed operatives with just a dog and a sidearm. Sarah smiled faintly and said it was not about what she had. It was about recognizing the threat and acting decisively. She had learned in combat that hesitation was the enemy, that when faced with danger, the best response was often a swift and overwhelming one. Riggs had provided that overwhelming force, and Sarah's training had provided the discipline to use it effectively. Carver nodded and said that Sarah's actions had likely saved Emily's life and had blown open a case that federal investigators had been trying to crack for months. It was a victory, but Sarah felt the weight of it differently. She thought about David Carter, a young Marine doing his job with integrity, paying the ultimate price for his honesty. She thought about Emily, a widow who had come to her door in desperation, and how close they had both come to becoming casualties in someone else's war. Sarah had spent her entire career protecting people, leading soldiers, making decisions that balanced risk and mission. Tonight had been no different, except that the mission was personal, and the soldiers were just two women and a dog against a corrupt network that had no regard for human life. The investigation stretched into the early morning hours, and by the time the last agent left, the sun was beginning to rise. Emily had been taken to a safe location, a secure facility where she would remain until the full scope of the smuggling operation was dismantled. Sarah stood in her now quiet living room, looking at the evidence markers still scattered across the floor, and felt the exhaustion beginning to set in. Riggs sat beside her, leaning his weight against her leg, and she reached down to scratch behind his ears. The dog had earned his rest, had proven once again why military working dogs were considered force multipliers on the battlefield. Sarah thought about Marcus, about the text she had sent him hours ago explaining what had happened. He had responded with pride and relief, thanking her for keeping Riggs safe and for trusting the dog's instincts. Sarah knew that trust had been the key to everything. Trust in her training, trust in the dog, trust in her own ability to act when action was needed. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat on the couch, trying to process the night's events. She had been home from deployment for only 17 days, and already she had faced a threat as serious as anything she had encountered overseas. It was a stark reminder that the battles soldiers fought were not always confined to distant deserts and mountains, that sometimes the fight came home, and that the skills they developed in service were needed in ways they could never predict. Sarah thought about leadership, about what it meant to protect people, about the responsibility that came with training and experience. She had always told her soldiers that leadership was not about rank or position. It was about being willing to step up when others needed you, about using your skills to make a difference, about never turning away from someone asking for help. Tonight, she had lived those words, and the cost had been high, but the outcome had been just. She closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, a moment to feel the fear she had suppressed during the confrontation, the weight of knowing how easily things could have gone wrong. The days following the incident brought a whirlwind of attention that Sarah had not anticipated. The FBI's investigation expanded rapidly, leading to arrests across multiple states and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen military equipment. Emily's husband David was posthumously recognized for his integrity and courage, his name cleared of any implication in the corruption he had worked to expose. The media picked up the story, focusing on the young widow who had been targeted and the Army captain who had protected her. Sarah found herself in the uncomfortable position of being called a hero, a label she had never sought and did not feel she deserved. She had simply done what needed to be done, using the training and resources available to her. But the public response was overwhelming, with messages of support and gratitude flooding in from across the country. Veterans reached out to share their own stories of coming home and struggling to find purpose. Families of fallen service members thanked her for protecting Emily. Other women in the military expressed pride in seeing a female officer take decisive action in the face of danger. Sarah read the messages with a mixture of humility and responsibility. She realized that her actions had become more than just a personal response to a crisis. They had become a symbol of what service members could do when they carried their values home with them. She thought about the conversations she had with her soldiers about resilience, about the importance of staying ready, about the warrior mindset that did not turn off just because the uniform came off. She had lived those lessons in the most tangible way possible, and now others were seeing the value in them too. Sarah received a call from her commanding officer, a colonel she deeply respected, who told her that the Army was proud of her, that her actions reflected the highest standards of the service, and that there would be formal recognition forthcoming. Sarah thanked him, but said that the real recognition should go to Emily for having the courage to seek help, and to Riggs for being the early warning system that made the difference. The colonel laughed and agreed, saying that military working dogs rarely got the credit they deserved, but that this time the story was highlighting their importance. Marcus returned from his deployment a week later, and Sarah met him at his house to return Riggs. The reunion between handler and dog was emotional, the kind of bond that only formed through shared danger and absolute trust. Marcus thanked Sarah for taking care of his partner, and Sarah told him that Riggs had taken care of her, that the dog had been the difference between a safe outcome and a potential tragedy. They talked for hours about the incident, about the investigation, about the ways that military training translated to civilian life. Marcus said that one of the hardest parts of transitioning out of active duty was feeling like the skills they had developed no longer mattered, that the discipline and readiness they had cultivated had no place in the regular world. But Sarah's experience proved otherwise. It showed that the values of service, the instinct to protect, the willingness to act under pressure, those things were needed everywhere, not just on the battlefield. They were needed in neighborhoods and communities, in moments of crisis when ordinary people needed someone with the courage to stand up. Sarah thought about her own transition, about the 17 days she had spent adjusting to civilian life before Emily knocked on her door. She had felt adrift, disconnected from the sense of purpose that had defined her for so long. But that night had reconnected her, had shown her that service did not end with deployment, that the mission continued as long as there were people who needed help and someone willing to provide it. She realized that being a leader was not confined to commanding soldiers in combat. It was about recognizing when your skills could make a difference and stepping forward without hesitation. It was about mentoring the next generation, about setting an example, about living the values you preached even when no one was watching. Sarah had always believed in leading from the front, in being the kind of officer her soldiers could trust and respect. Now she understood that those principles applied to every aspect of her life, that leadership was not a role you played, it was a way of being. In the weeks that followed, Sarah was invited to speak at military events and veteran organizations, sharing her story and the lessons it represented. She was hesitant at first, uncomfortable with the spotlight, but she realized that her experience could help others, especially women in the military who often faced unique challenges and doubts about their place in a male-dominated field. Sarah spoke candidly about her journey, about the struggles of command, the loneliness of leadership, and the pressure of making life-and-death decisions. She talked about losing her husband, about the grief that never fully went away, and about finding the strength to keep moving forward. She explained that the night Emily came to her door, she had been at a crossroads, unsure of how to transition from the purpose of military service to the uncertainty of civilian life. That night had given her clarity, had shown her that the transition was not about leaving one life behind and starting another. It was about carrying the best parts of her service into everything she did next. She spoke about Riggs, about the importance of military working dogs, and about the trust that had to exist between handler and animal, between soldier and teammate. She emphasized that trust was the foundation of everything in the military, that without it, units fell apart, missions failed, and lives were lost. She had trusted Riggs that night, had listened when the dog signaled danger, and that trust had saved them both. Sarah also spoke about Emily, about the courage it took for a grieving widow to seek help, to trust a stranger, to believe that someone would stand with her when she had nowhere else to turn. That kind of vulnerability was its own form of bravery, and Sarah made sure her audiences understood that heroism came in many forms. Not just on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments when people chose to keep going despite overwhelming odds. The response to Sarah's talks was powerful, with many attendees reaching out afterward to share their own stories or to ask for advice on their own transitions. Sarah found herself becoming a mentor, a role she embraced with the same dedication she had brought to commanding her company. She worked with veteran organizations to develop programs that helped service members recognize the value of their military skills in civilian contexts, to see that discipline, resilience, teamwork, and leadership were not just military traits, but life skills that could transform communities. She partnered with K-9 veteran groups to raise awareness about retired military working dogs and the handlers who continued to care for them. She became an advocate for families of fallen service members, using her platform to push for better support systems and accountability. Sarah's life took on a new shape, one that was still rooted in service but expressed in different ways. She returned to her unit and continued her duties as a company commander, but now she carried with her a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve beyond the uniform. She saw her soldiers not just as troops to be led, but as individuals who would one day face their own transitions, their own moments of crisis, and she worked to prepare them for that reality. She incorporated more training on resilience and adaptability, on recognizing threats in unconventional environments, on the importance of trust and teamwork in all situations. She brought in guest speakers, including Marcus and Riggs, to talk about the role of military working dogs and the bonds that made them effective. She encouraged her soldiers to think about service as a mindset, not just a job, and to carry that mindset into every aspect of their lives. Sarah also reconnected with Emily, who had begun to rebuild her life with the support of victim services and the veteran community. Emily told Sarah that the night she knocked on that door, she had been at the end of her strength, ready to give up. But Sarah's willingness to help, to believe her, to fight for her, had given Emily the courage to keep going. Now Emily was working with organizations that supported military spouses, sharing her story and helping others navigate the challenges of grief and resilience. The two women formed a deep friendship, bonded by the crisis they had survived and the mutual respect they had for each other's strength.